You ever have that moment where reality feels so absurd, so completely detached from sanity, that you actually taste metal in your mouth? I did, standing barefoot on my front porch, watching the president of our homeowners association dial 911 because my wife, my incredibly patient, terrifyingly competent wife, had the audacity to change the deadbolt on our own front door, and as I watched Patricia Patty Sterling jab her manicured finger at the air, screaming to the dispatcher that there was an active trespassing situation at our address, I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or tackle her, because what Patty didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her little bubble of suburban tyranny, was that she wasn't calling the cops on a helpless housewife. She was trying to arrest Special Agent Natasha Vance of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, a woman who spends her days hunting down international money launderers and cartel financiers, and who had spent the last 90 days quietly building a federal case that was about to turn Patty's life into a cautionary tale for narcissists everywhere. But before the flashing lights and the handcuffs, you have to understand how we got here, how a peaceful slice of heaven in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, turned into a battlefield. And it starts with me, Caleb Vance, a guy who spent 2 decades turning wrenches on Air Force jets, learning that if an engine sounds wrong, you don't ignore it. You tear it down until you find the crack before it kills someone. When Natasha's grandfather passed and left us his cabin, it felt like the universe finally cutting us a break. A beautiful, rugged A-frame built in the 70s, long before the developers came in and carved up the surrounding forest into Timberline Heights, a gated community of $3 million McMansions and people who think net worth is a personality trait. We had what's called grandfathered status, meaning our property was technically independent of the association's draconian bylaws, or so we thought, until the white Range Rover with the custom plate Q&B rolled up our driveway like a Panzer tank invading Poland. Out stepped Patricia Sterling, a woman wearing enough turquoise jewelry to sink a canoe, clutching a clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments, and she didn't say hello, didn't welcome us to the neighborhood. She just pointed a trembling finger at our newly installed front door, a gorgeous, custom-milled mahogany piece I'd spent 3 weeks refining, and declared it an aesthetic violation of community integrity, slapping a citation on our railing that demanded a $500 fine and immediate removal. I remember looking at Natasha, seeing that familiar, scary calmness settle over her face, the same look she gets right before a raid, and she just took a sip of her coffee, the steam curling around her face in the crisp mountain air, and asked, very quietly, "Which article of the covenants does this violate, exactly?" Which was the wrong question to ask a woman who believed she was the judge, jury, and executioner of Timberline Heights, because Patty just laughed, a sound like glass breaking in, a garbage disposal, and said, "Honey, I don't need to quote articles to know trash when I see it. And if you think your little grandfather clause protects you from maintaining standards, you're going to find out that my husband, Councilman Robert Sterling, has very influential friends in zoning." That was the first mistake, threatening a federal agent with local bureaucracy, but Natasha didn't flash her badge, didn't scream. She just let Patty drive away, and then spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind working through the puzzle, because my wife doesn't get mad. She gets curious, and curiosity from a woman with federal subpoena power is a dangerous thing. The escalation didn't take long, maybe 3 days, before Patty decided to go nuclear, showing up at 7 a.m. with a man who looked like a thumb with a mustache, introducing him as Doug, the exclusive community compliance inspector, and demanding access to our home to check for unauthorized structural modifications that she claimed posed a fire risk to the entire mountainside. I blocked the doorway, my knuckles white, feeling that old military instinct to defend the perimeter kicking in, but Natasha just stepped out, leaning against the doorframe with that deceptive casualness, and asked Doug for his state licensure number, watching him crumble, stammering about being a consultant, while Patty shrieked about emergency powers and safety protocols that allowed them to bypass the Fourth Amendment, because, in her mind, the HOA handbook superseded the Constitution. "Show me the minutes," Natasha said, her voice cutting through Patty's hysteria like a scalpel. "Show me the emergency meeting minutes where the board voted to authorize a warrantless search of a private residence that isn't even legally part of your jurisdiction." And watching Patty's face turn that unique shade of purple was satisfying, sure, but it was the look in her eyes, That pure, unadulterated malice. That told me this wasn't over, that she was going to burn us down just to prove she could. We retreated inside, and I asked Natasha if we should just hire a lawyer, get a restraining order, do the normal civilian thing. But she was already at the kitchen table, her laptop open, logging into databases that civilians aren't supposed to know exist, her eyes scanning through public records and financial filings with a speed that made me dizzy. "It's not just power, Caleb," she murmured, pulling up a spreadsheet that looked like a chaotic mess of numbers to me, but clearly told a story to her. "It's always about the money. People like this don't just want control for the sake of ego. They want it because it pays." And that's when she found it, the first loose thread in a sweater that was about to unravel the entire neighborhood. She spun the laptop around, pointing to a series of payments for emergency road stabilization, totaling nearly $250,000 over 2 years, all paid to a company called Sterling Summit Solutions, which, according to the Idaho Secretary of State website she had open in another tab, was registered to a residential address that matched the one on Doug's driver's license, a license she had memorized in the 3 seconds he held it up earlier. "Patty's not just a bully," Natasha whispered, a cold smile touching her lips. "She's running a washing machine, taking dues from these people, funneling them into fake repair companies owned by her cronies, and using the emergency clause to bypass the requirement for a community vote." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, a realization that we were sleeping next door to a criminal enterprise disguised as a suburban dictatorship. But before we could even formulate a plan, a rock shattered our living room window, landing on the rug with a note wrapped around it that read, "Get out while you can." And I looked at Natasha, expecting fear, expecting hesitation. But all I saw was the predator waking up. "They have no idea," she said, picking up the rock and bagging it like evidence. "They have absolutely no idea who they just declared war on." The psychological warfare campaign Patty launched against us was honestly impressive in its pettiness, a masterclass in suburban terrorism that started with the weaponization of the wellness check, meaning every morning at 6 a.m., a different member of her loyal board would bang on our door, feigning concern that they heard screaming or smelled gas, just to wake us up and keep us on edge. It was relentless, a drip feed of harassment designed to make us crack, to make us pack up and sell our dream cabin for pennies on the dollar, which, according to the property records Natasha was uncovering, was exactly what had happened to the last 3 families who dared to question the association fees. My workshop became the next target, my sanctuary where I restored vintage furniture, suddenly deemed a commercial noise hazard by Patty, who sent a ceaseless stream of citations claiming my table saw violated decibel limits, even though the only thing louder than my tools was the sound of her own voice shrieking at the mailman. One afternoon, a city code enforcer named Officer Grimes showed up, looking bored and annoyed, clearly sent by Councilman Sterling, and demanded to inspect my wiring, poking around my shop with a sneer, looking for anything, a frayed wire, an ungrounded outlet, that could shut me down. I watched Natasha watch him, her eyes tracking his movements, noting how he skipped the actual safety checks and went straight for the breaker box, trying to find a reason to cut my power. And when he finally admitted he couldn't find a single violation, she stepped in, handing him a cup of coffee and asking, "So, how long have you known the Sterlings? Do you guys golf at the same club?" And the way Grimes flinched, the way his eyes darted to the door, confirmed everything we needed to know. This corruption went way beyond just a neighborhood bully. It was rooted deep in the local good old boy network. But while they were playing checkers, checking for noise violations and sending nasty letters, Natasha was playing 4D chess, building a dossier that was growing thicker by the day, filled with bank statements, shell company registrations, and affidavits she'd quietly collected from terrified neighbors like Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow down the street who had been bullied into paying $10,000 for a roof assessment. That never happened. Natasha would sit up late at night, the blue light of her monitors reflecting in her glasses, tracing the flow of money from the HOA reserves into Sterling Summit Solutions, then out to offshore accounts and luxury car dealerships, muttering things like wire fraud, mail fraud, RICO predicate. "Oh, Patty, you greedy, greedy girl." The breaking point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, was the emergency community meeting Patty called on a Friday night, held in the drafty community center, a room thick with tension and the smell of stale donuts, where she stood on a stage like a dictatorial televangelist, projecting a PowerPoint presentation that listed us, the Vances, as threats to community cohesion. She actually had a slide with a blurry photo of me taking out the trash, captioned hostile behavior, and she stood there, dripping in fake diamonds, telling the room that our refusal to pay the arbitrary fines was forcing the HOA to raise dues for everyone else, effectively turning the entire neighborhood against us. I wanted to stand up and scream, to tell these people they were being robbed blind, but Natasha grabbed my wrist, her grip like iron, and whispered, "Wait for it." And then she stood up, looking small in her oversized flannel shirt, and asked, in a voice that carried to the back of the room, "Mrs. President, regarding the voting proxies you're using to authorize this legal action against us, can you produce the signed affidavits from the absent homeowners? Or are we just counting the invisible friends in your head?" The room went dead silent. The air sucked out of the space, and Patty turned a shade of red that defied physics, stammering about administrative confidentiality. But the seed of doubt was planted, the murmurs starting in the back row, neighbors looking at each other, wondering why they had never seen a financial audit in 5 years. As we walked out, Patty cornered us in the parking lot, her mask slipping completely, her face twisted into a snarl that looked demonic under the sodium streetlights. "You think you're clever," she hissed, leaning into Natasha's personal space. "But you're just visitors here, and accidents happen in the mountains all the time. Brakes fail, fires start, people disappear." It was a death threat, plain and simple, delivered with the arrogance of someone who has never faced a consequence in her life, and I saw Natasha smile, a genuine, terrifying smile, and she replied, "You're right, Patty, accidents do happen, but usually only to people who get sloppy." And we drove away, leaving her standing there, fuming, unaware that she had just handed a federal agent the probable cause she needed to open a formal racketeering investigation. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of a chainsaw ripping through the silence, and I ran outside to find Doug, the contractor crony, cutting down a massive ponderosa pine on the property line, aiming it directly at our fence, and before I could even shout, the tree came crashing down, crushing 30 feet of my custom cedar fencing and missing my workshop by inches. "Whoops," Doug smirked, revving the saw. "Wind caught it. Guess you should have maintained your perimeter better." And that was it. The physical attack we'd been waiting for, the undeniable proof of criminal intent. Natasha didn't yell. She didn't call the sheriff. She just took photos of the stump, pointing out the wedge cut that proved it was dropped intentionally, and said, "Destruction of property across state lines. Intimidation of a federal witness. Caleb, go inside and pour me a bourbon," because Patty just upgraded herself from a fraud case to a domestic terrorism suspect. The end came on a Tuesday, under a sky so blue it looked painted on, when Patty decided to play her final, fatal card by calling the cops on Natasha for changing the locks, screaming about trespassing on HOA-governed entryways, creating a spectacle that drew every neighbor out of their homes like moths to a flame. The two deputies who arrived looked exhausted, clearly familiar with Patty's antics, but bound by duty to investigate. And as Patty stood there, clutching her pearls and demanding they arrest this woman for endangering community safety, I watched Natasha reach into her back pocket, not for a weapon, but for the leather wallet that held the power to end this entire charade. "Officers," Natasha said, her voice cutting through Patty's screeching like a knife through silk, "before you put handcuffs on anyone, you might want to see this." And she flipped the wallet open, the gold badge of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division catching the sunlight, flashing like a beacon of absolute authority. The mood shifted instantly, the deputies straightening their spines, their eyes widening as Natasha continued. "I am Special Agent Vance, and I am currently conducting an active federal investigation into a massive embezzlement scheme, wire fraud, and insurance fraud ring operating out of this address. And unless you want to be named as accessories to a federal crime, I suggest you step back and let me finish my work." Patty froze, literally froze, like a glitch in the Matrix, her mouth open mid-scream, her brain unable to process that the troublemaker she'd been harassing was actually a high-ranking federal officer who could buy and sell her husband's political influence with a single phone call to Washington. This is fake," Patty shrieked, her voice cracking. She bought that online. Arrest her. But the deputies were already backing away, turning their attention to Patty, asking for her identification, asking why she was interfering with a federal agent. And the look of sheer, unadulterated terror that washed over her face was better than any lottery win. The takedown happened 3 days later at the monthly board meeting, but this time, the doors were locked from the outside by federal marshals. Natasha took the stage, not as a resident, but as the lead prosecutor of her own case, projecting bank statements onto the screen that showed Patty and Councilman Sterling had stolen over $1.2 million from the community in 4 years. Money meant for roads, for snow removal, for the school fund, all funneled into renovations for their vacation home in Cabo. When the tactical team breached the back doors, the sound of boots hitting the floor was thunderous, a symphony of justice that ended with Patty being let out in handcuffs, mascara running down her face, screaming that she was a victim, while Doug was tackled in the parking lot trying to flee in his truck. The silence that followed her exit was heavy, profound, until Mrs. Gable started clapping, a slow, rhythmic applause that swelled until the entire room was cheering, crying, hugging, the weight of years of tyranny lifting off their shoulders. In the end, Patty got 8 years in federal prison. Her husband was indicted and forced to resign in disgrace, and the assets seized by the government, the cars, the boats, the jewelry, were liquidated to pay back every single cent to the neighbors she had robbed. We used the extra funds to build a community park where the unauthorized trees used to stand, a place where people actually talk to each other now, where the fear is gone. But as I sit here on my deck, watching the sun set over a peaceful Timberline Heights, I have to ask you, is it really justice? Sure, she went to jail, but what about the years of stress, the families who moved away broken and bankrupt, the people who didn't have a federal agent in the family to fight back? It makes you wonder how many Patty Sterlings are out there right now, ruling their little kingdoms, protected by apathy and fear, waiting for someone to finally say enough. What do you think? Does the punishment fit the crime, or did she get off easy? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because trust me, you haven't heard the last of what goes on in these mountains.
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.